A real pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Erich Becker, the founder and managing partner of Exergy Capital. And I think perhaps, Erich, could you first tell us a little more about your work at Exergy, the main focuses of your attention right now in this incredibly diverse field?
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction and having the opportunity to be here. Exergy has a focus on what we label the global energy transition. So let's maybe start and take a step back what this energy transition is about. In our definition, we try to simplify the trend of the energy transition, and what we are all observing is an increasing decarbonization of the energy value chain, promoting lower carbon energy technologies, which, at least in my professional career, is the opportunity of a lifetime. Its dimensions are gigantic. When I speak to investors and they ask me to quantify the opportunity set, the numbers are generally mind-blowing. According to even conservative estimates, between now and 2050, $3,500 billion need to be invested per year in order to keep the lights on, in order to keep the transportation sector moving, not only for decarbonization, but also in order to maintain and replace aging energy infrastructure. Other trends are, in addition to decarbonization, also topics like electrification of the energy value chain, and last not least, digitization, enabling us to use what we have in a much more efficient way, and not only thinking about adding more and more capacity, but reducing our individual energy footprints. And these are the main three drivers that we are focusing on.
Interesting. I think the whole area covers a range of different captions. You could probably say hydro, solar, wind, biomass, geothermal. What specific technologies have you been promoting best? Which are the most promising long-term solutions in your view?
When looking at how advanced economies have transitioned their energy sectors, clearly they started off with hydropower, a technology that has been around for more than a century. Followed over the last 20 years, particularly by wind and solar, where we saw very steep learning curves driving down equipment costs to when I started to look at the solar sector, equipment costs were 10 times on a per megawatt basis of what they are right now. Moving on into more advanced sectors, you mentioned deep geothermal, but we should not forget that in the same mindset that's driving the energy transition, we also woke up to the fact that waste streams can be valuable. What we used to dump into landfills can have a value in context of recapturing basically plastics, in context of generating energy out of these waste streams. So there is a lot of progress being made there on these more advanced waste-to-energy technologies, which we are focusing on. Also on bio-waste, biomass, using these waste streams in order to create alternative fuels, an alternative to natural gas in the form of biomethane. And last not least, as I mentioned during the introduction, energy efficiency. Looking at the energy sector in a different way, not focusing too much on how can I produce more and more, but how can I reduce my energy consumption and consume less instead.
Very interesting. What sort of timeline do you put on this? When do you think people really started focusing on this? Do you see the efforts as accelerating? What is the end game, if you like?
The efforts are definitely accelerating, especially over the last years, as a global consensus has been reached in context of decarbonization goals. I saw the first big trend towards this decarbonization roughly like 2 decades ago, when certain countries started to implement regulatory regimes promoting renewables, supporting renewables via fixed price offtake agreements in the form of feed-in tariffs and similar mechanisms and tools, which allowed for mass rollout of these technologies and mass rollout resulting in mass productions, driving down cost. Now we've reached a stage where not all of these technologies have to be supported anymore, but they're competitive economically against traditionally conventional forms of energy, oil-driven technologies, natural gas-driven technologies. And now we're in a different world where the private sector is actually driving these projects.
Erich, you touched on sponsorship. How do you see the roles of government and the private sector in terms of driving these very important changes?
The energy transition, as we see it, was initially enabled by governments establishing robust regulatory frameworks that allowed investors to rely on a certain mechanism, being able to predict cash flows more accurately, calculate returns with a certain degree of certainty, and that attracted a lot of private capital flowing into it. Right. But the first step was governments establishing these frameworks. Now, as you have pointed out, subsidy-free wind farms, solar parks are meanwhile entirely driven by private investors, infrastructure investors, as well as, of course, the banking sector providing long-term project finance facilities.
Right. I wondered if we could change or turn to the financing of these projects. When I started my investment banking career, we were working on major project financings. You had stacks of capital supplied by banks coming into the project. Private equity just didn't exist in this space. How do you see that balance developing?
Long-term project finance is certainly available for very established, proven technologies, such as hydro, such as wind, such as solar, with a certain degree of price certainty for the electricity they are generating, with a certain degree of comfort in terms of production rates and utilization of these assets. But the more advanced areas that we are particularly excited about, they still lack certain comfort levels of project lenders. There you need to be a strong equity sponsor of these projects or companies in certain areas. And in a very creative way, via contractual structuring, create certainty to allow banks getting comfortable with it. But it's pretty much an equity-first approach, which as a result also delivers much higher returns than the standard wind and solar parks these days.
I mean, you had different phases of any major project. You had the early greenfield, you had the later greenfield, you had the construction phase, you had the brownfield and the subsequent development phase. Where do you see the sweet spot for project financing at the moment?
Well, again, to differentiate between your risk preference, of course, from a bank's perspective, banks typically get involved in our sector when you have a situation that we label as financial close, when any situation is de-risked to a degree that you eliminate cost uncertainty around the construction of an asset, where you've got off-take contracts in place, maintenance and operations agreements in place. That's where banks tend to get involved. The early greenfield stage, the development phase, permitting risk is typically borne by equity. But during these phases, if you know what you're doing and have the right skill sets, that's where the sweet spot from an equity return is defined.
Right, I see. That's very interesting. There's been quite a lot of discussion about PPP, private-public finance. How do you see this developing? Do you see the balance in terms of risk between the private financier and the public source changing? How is this evolving?
Origins of the renewable energy sector, predominantly in Europe, was actually quite comparable to public-private partnerships, because you had a strong regulatory system established by a government which granted you the right to feed energy into the system, which granted you the right to sell energy at a predetermined price for 20 years or sometimes even longer, which granted you the right to get transmission access. So in a sense, that reminded me a lot of the traditional concession-based structures. Quite a lot of these elements are falling away just because the technologies have become so competitive that they work on an economic basis.
I think that when you look at private equity houses, Riverstone is a name obviously that comes to mind, and they've done several, I think 2 or 3 renewable energy funds, one in conjunction with Carlyle. Do you see we should have more Riverstones? Do you see boutique private equity houses playing an increasing role? How do you see that equilibrium playing out?
Where there's a big demand for private equity in context of the energy transition is certainly in niche areas, the areas where banks don't get involved yet, the areas where the large infrastructure funds don't get involved. And here there's a role for private equity to de-risk these niche sectors, capturing superior risk-adjusted returns. So it's finding technologies which don't necessarily have to be unproven, but are indeed proven, are still below the radar screen of the Riverstones of this world, of the large infrastructure funds of this world, and helping them to grow. And once they're scalable enough, have cash flows of critical size, these funds could be an attractive exit opportunity for any private equity investor. I mean, there is a lot of equity targeting these stable, yielding, cash-flowing projects and companies. I've heard numbers of $150 billion chasing these deals in Europe alone. The opportunity has to be big enough, and the cash flows have to be predictable and stable.
Indeed.
So the role for private equity, from my perspective, is to allow projects and companies get there, and then, of course, you're tapping into a much more competitive cost of capital to fund the remaining lifetime of.
Of course, in these projects, by definition, you've got a social impact. Do you find that investors are significantly interested in ESG considerations, in UN sustainable goals and all of those good things? Does that come into your conversation with investors?
When we speak to investors, typically it's one of the key questions. It's not even a question anymore. People are assuming that you are investing according to UN PRI's principles for responsible investment, or pursue the sustainable development goals, definitely in accordance with ESG ratings. So it's a given.
So it's a given. It's not specifically come up for discussion. If you look geographically, I mean, I think you can divide between Western countries, for want of a better word, some of which have fossil fuels, but which are probably under the greatest pressure to move to renewables. And then you've got 2 massive economies, India and China, that are huge importers of fossil fuel. Well, I think some progress is being made, or efforts are being made in China to change that. And then you've got this part of the world. I mean, how would you see the dynamics in terms of progress in renewables between these different geographies?
I mean, the interest level for what we are doing is very different in different parts of the world. Starting in Europe, clearly investors are looking for a differentiated approach to tap into these niche opportunities that I explained, and investors have already their portfolios pretty full of traditional infrastructure investment funds or even renewable infrastructure funds. In this part of the world, we're seeing a lot of interest in the energy efficiency technologies that we are promoting, in knowledge transfer or getting access to state-of-the-art companies in Europe and bringing them across to the region. So either this technology transfer, knowledge transfer, or basically investing in companies that you then also can leverage for your own national economies. Also, we shouldn't forget that every barrel of oil or BCF of gas that I'm not consuming domestically at subsidized rates can be exported at much better prices. So there's this energy savings element, which is very important.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Two very good questions. The first one, yes, we do see indeed a lot of government initiatives in the region here promoting basically renewable energy infrastructure investments or energy infrastructure investments or even energy efficiency trends. And we're having a number of conversations with regulators in the region about these opportunities. Clearly, any private investor needs to work with governments in this area, since the energy sector is a very sensitive area, and you need a large-scale infrastructure in order to deliver energy from its source to the end consumers, which in most countries has certain legal requirements, regulatory requirements, so it only works if you work with the government. Your other question relating to the definition of clean energy, you're absolutely correct. There is no single definition of clean energy. Some people would exclude natural gas. Others say, look, natural gas is a very important transition fuel, very efficient. From my perspective, and that's why we try to simplify our definition of this energy transition, it's about decarbonization, reducing the energy footprint. In certain areas, natural gas could mean we are increasing the carbon footprint, but in other areas it could mean a decrease because we're replacing oil or coal generation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we've got to finish now, unfortunately, but certainly Dr. Richter will be available for any questions afterwards. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.